Hey listeners, Jen here. I run SupChina Direct, SupChina's consulting and expertise marketplace. We help you solve all your China business problems by connecting you with China leading experts and consultants in China and around the world. A client of ours is a New York-based fintech startup focused on the peer-to-peer lending space. You may have even read on SupChina.com in our recent article called The Final Meltdown, P2P in China in 2020, that the space essentially is under severe regulatory duress. Nonetheless, our client knows that the second largest economy, and one day inevitably to become the first largest economy, she cannot ignore the China P2P market to achieve true global success. So after learning about her specific needs and objectives, SupChina Direct paired her with a Hong Kong-based financial services consulting firm that was first able to provide a top-down view of the industry and competitive landscape. Following that, we connected the client to a Shanghai-based executive, formerly a VP at China's largest fintech startup, who facilitated on-the-ground meetings with regulators, peer organizations, and also introduced her to her first China-based hires. If you've got aspirations or challenges related to doing business in China, SupChina Direct will help you identify and vet qualified consultants. Our network of professionals and experts cover all industries, all functions, and all regions within China. Don't waste another day in looking for the right support. You can find it now at supchina.direct.
Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong. My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
China Econ Talk listeners, I am losing my edge. I'm turning 40 in 4 months. I can't drink 2 beers without getting a hangover, and I'm working full-time on a podcast and newsletter that doesn't cover rent. Sad to say, but yes, losing my edge. Then again, it's no surprise that I'm turning out to be a Fubuchida Ado. America's technological edge, on the other hand. Boy, we had high hopes for you. The U.S. went to the moon, but now can't develop a 5G ecosystem to save its life. But not to worry, because Adam Siegel, director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council of Foreign Relations, alongside a host of ridiculously accomplished people, has a plan to get America its tech groove back. Adam, welcome to China Econ Talk. So you've been studying Chinese tech policy way before it was cool, and certainly way before it was inevitable that Chinese firms and researchers would have the sort of success that would prompt CFR to write a policy paper about how America should respond. So speaking of gaining an edge in the first place, what do you think the Chinese system did right, particularly with respect to technology policy?
Well, I think a lot of what attracts the attention of U.S. policymakers is not what the Chinese got right. So, U.S. policymakers, I think, tend to have this view of the Chinese technology policy as being long range and strategic and top down. We know that the most successful parts of the Chinese tech economy are the ones that kind of grew up ignored or initially ignored by the Chinese state. But I think what really worked for the Chinese system was just a huge amount of flexibility, that it really acted in some ways like a federal system, that localities and provinces managed to experiment with different forms and shapes and took advantage of a huge inflow of capital and talent, and put together some amazing internet platforms. I think there's still real questions about what type of innovation we've seen in China, but so far the system has managed to be fairly flexible.
So can you talk a little bit about this idea of techno-nationalism and how, if at all, it's evolved since you've started studying this field?
Sure. I think the simplest way is to describe it is just to say that the Chinese have a long-standing concern about dependence on foreign suppliers for critical technologies, and this has been true, since the self-strengthening movement, but clearly under the CCP from the time of the Soviet split onward. And you can see a whole range of policies that were put in place that were designed to reduce that dependence and help Chinese producers move up the value chain. I think the biggest change is that voice now dominates. If you look at the 2006 mid to long term plan, which really talked about indigenous innovation and set goals for reducing the percentage of foreign suppliers in critical technologies, that document really has two voices. The first half of the document really is all of kind of a techno-nationalism top-down mega projects, the state is going to drive us kind of voice. The second half of the paper is really, let's create ecosystems of innovation. Let's support IP. Let's support entrepreneurship. And I think what's really happened under Xi is that those voices have really lost traction. You just don't hear them very much, and the dominant voice is really the one of indigenous innovation, self-reliance, secure and controllable.
So why do you think that narrative won out over the second one?
I think in part, it fits Xi Jinping's vision of what the Chinese economy should look like. It's driven in part by the party's, I think, desire for control over these technologies that it sees are going to be critical to governance, to control of the population, to competition, to national security. I think the conflict with the United States has also made it much harder to those voices to really argue that the way that China has moved up the value chain is by being open and cooperative. And so the tech war, Snowden revelations, all of those things together also undermine those voices.
So where do SOEs fit into this model?
So the SOEs, for a large part, were not particularly important players in the Chinese R&D system. A lot of it was happening at the Chinese Academy of Science. And SOEs had large R&D budgets, but not very much was coming out of it. And so, what we saw in the 80s and 90s is an attempt to both kind of increase the efficacy of the SOE's R&D budgets and tighten their links to academia and other parts of the economy. It's been marginally successful. The R&D budgets have gone up, but I still think that probably the most interesting innovation is in R&D is happening outside of the SOEs.
What's particular about the Chinese Academy of Sciences? Was it based on Western models, and what have they done differently in their system of doing this more basic research?
Yeah, it was based on the Chinese academies were based on the Russian model, and so the idea was that you would have all of these high-level R&D institutes in specific fields with the best researchers there. The problem was, especially in the 70s and 80s, was that these institutes had very little, if no connection to industry. And what you saw in the late 80s and 90s were reforms that were designed to increase those connections and also incentivize the academies or academicians to start their own companies. So the first generation of people who, Xiao Haid, who jumped into the sea, started that first generation of Chinese software and hardware companies. So Lenovo, which was Legend before that, came out of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. What we've seen since then is, the incentives for the labs. The labs had their central support cut. They had to find other sources of money, and so that also drove them closer to the market. And they have gotten better at being able to provide the basic research that will one day hopefully be commercialized. But they're still fairly focused on kind of applied and development on the commercial side.
Sure. Let's come to this this report you recently put out. First off, I'm curious because the sort of list of members of this task force is so impressive that I'm curious what the sort of structure was, how you guys decided to work together, and if anything particularly interesting happened engaging with so many people from so many different fields. I mean, just for instance, we have Eric Schmidt, we had Reid Hoffman, we have Admiral McRaven. This combination of like military folks, Silicon Valley academics, who don't always sit around and write long papers together.
Yeah, so the way the task forces are set up, basically they're out of the executive office at the council, so out of the president's office. They're independent, so basically they're set up, and then the chairs and myself and the task force members, are the ones who write it with no other kind of feedback from the institution. The members mainly of the task force are drawn from the council membership. I think almost everyone. There might be one or two people who are not, council members in some way or another. together.
Yeah.
I think, there is a lot going on now, I think, between the Valley and the policy community, especially after Snowden revelations. There was, a kind of Western migration of all the think tanks that said, oh, we should actually be talking to the tech community more. And the council is just one of the think tanks that does this. CSIS, when they did their last cybersecurity report, they had two groups, one in the West Coast, one on the East Coast. I could probably go through the number of the other think tanks have this kind of attempt to reach out to the tech community. I think the most kind of contentious issue in the report, or kind of the one that we spent the most time trying to come up with a consensus, was, and this is what Adam McRaven received the headlines for when we rolled out the report, is how to describe this moment. And McRaven described it as our oh shit moment. But the question was, how hyperbolic, or how do we want to describe the risk? And in particular, how do we describe China? And so that, there were some people who, really wanted to hammer home the risk from China. There were others who, basically said the report should be about more than China, which there is a paragraph in the report that does say that. But that, I think, was the thing that we were constantly kind of moving around and trying to figure out. A lot of the people on the task force are involved in other efforts. So, the DIB, the Defense Innovation Board, Reid Hoffman and Eric Schmidt, Admiral McRaven used to be a member of that. They all sit on that as well. So there's a lot of kind of ideas that are common to us, and I think are in circulation in the policymaking community right now.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting when the thought process behind trying to push domestic reforms and to what extent China is driving them, and whether there are potential dangers to overreacting to the Chinese threat. So interesting that in your in this little group was sort of a microcosm of to what extent people really wanted to frame China as a real challenge. Do you see any downsides to overplaying the risk the U.S. faces?
I think there are kind of two major ones. I think that one of them is we don't want to frame all of Chinese scientific and technological progress as a risk to the United States. There are so many common issues, global issues that the world would benefit from more innovation from, and we don't want to get into a world where we're seeing every step forward for China as a step backwards for the United States, right? When I get a headache, I don't really care that the Germans were the ones who invented aspirin first. I'm glad we all have aspirin.
Well, Adam, have you been watching The Watchmen?
I have not. No.
Okay. Well, there's a pill where no spoilers here on the China Econ Talk Show. You don't come for that. Anyways, moving on.
And I think the second issue is is one that lots of people have talked about, is there's so many things that are happening that are designed to try and slow China down, that have the potential to do real self-damage to the U.S. innovation side. And, here in particular, people talk about, possible restrictions on students, or export controls that are overly broad, CFIUS reviews that are also overly broad. So those, I think, are the main concerns. Is, not everything should be competitive, and we want to make sure we don't shoot ourselves in the foot.
So, Adam, that said, you do write that America is facing significant challenges. So, in broad strokes, what do you think are the main breakpoints that the U.S. sort of technological industrial complex has been hitting over the past decade?
We focus primarily on kind of three issues. The first one, of course, is the federal spending support of basic R&D, which has dropped and has been flat for quite a while now, and plays an incredibly important role in kickstarting U.S. innovation. The second is really the kind of talent issue and the human pipeline. And then the third, we talk about the interaction between the DoD and private sector, and how accessing technologies in the private sector is important to U.S. military capabilities, and the DoD is still struggling with those connections.
Sure. So let's start with basic R&D. As you just said, pretty central to your argument that America is losing this edge is that the percentage of federal R&D spending as a percentage of GDP has dropped pretty dramatically since the end of the Cold War. And one of the central recommendations being that the U.S. should increase federal funding from its current level of about $150 billion up to $230 billion. So I'm curious, first off, is there any sense that there's $70 billion of basic research out there that needs this sort of funding? Or maybe there are some sort of dynamics happening where basic research is cheaper or less important than it used to be?
I think we probably could easily go through good research grants to the NSF, the National Science Foundation, or the NIH, the National Institute of Health. Both of those organizations are, not funding as much as they would like to. I think, the issue would be ensuring that the rollout of that money is kind of gradual and steady. In the past, when we've doubled research budgets, the problem has always been it then disappears, and universities overbuild and researchers get stranded. I don't think there's any issue. I think we can find the money to spend pretty quickly. The issue is, and we talk about in the report, is that so much of the money on research and development is being spent in the private sector. And that R&D money just doesn't do the same thing. It's mostly focused on, commercialization and application. It isn't the big kind of paradigm changing research in the kind of basic building blocks of science and technology. And kind of historically, it's really only government support that provides the stability and the kind of riskiness, the willingness to take those blue sky risks that can do it.
So say the U.S. does invest more money in basic R&D, and that does end up speeding technological progress. Why does it matter which country ends up doing this basic research in the first place?
Yeah, and I think that is quite honestly part of the response we've heard from the Hill, from congressional staffers. I mean, I think one is that they tell us don't tell us to spend any more money. We hear that all the time. That's just not going to happen. And then second, as several people did say to me, look, if we spend the money on the basic R&D, then others are going to, they can. It's basic R&D. It's publicly available, so they are going to. Other places can take advantage either through stealing it or just developing it themselves. So I think there is some concern that you want to make sure you protect it at least until the commercialization stage, to the extent that you stay with norms about openness. I think also you do have to think about the other parts of the recommendations, which are not as well developed in the task force, but I think are important, about supporting manufacturing in the states, working on kind of linking the R&D to local ecosystems of manufacturing and development. Under the Obama administration, there was a initiative called America Manufacturing. I think now it's called Manufacturing Inc. or Manufacturing America, which is a series of kind of university extensions and cooperative research that would tie it to local manufacturing and to local jobs and local development.
I think there's something to be said for, even if the research is going to be made in the public domain, the fact that it's happening, in the U.S., the grad students who are going to be the ones who end up creating the companies are the ones who will have worked on these papers, and stealing breakthrough technology isn't the most straightforward thing. And just because you have the blueprints doesn't necessarily mean you have the sort of like the know-how, the experience to really commercialize this stuff. So I think there is, I'd argue, some value in doing it locally.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think when you look at some of the most successful kind of interventions that the U.S. government has made in this space, a lot of it is not, the basic R&D matters, but also what matters is, as you said, kind of the training of graduate students, the bringing people together across interdisciplinary work. connections between industry and academia, and all of that stuff is incredibly hard to replicate. And as you said, even if you steal the information, there's a huge amount of tacit knowledge that really is necessary for commercializing products.
The other question, which is sort of, I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer for, but it's interesting to think about what if the new breakthroughs that this marginal increase in basic research contributes to ends up flattening the balance of power instead of reinforcing America's edge.
So how would that work?
Well, I don't know. Like, think about drones, right? Drones are like a new thing that's been invented recently, and one can argue that this has made terrorists' lives easier or something, or like it's,
right.
like technical innovations that would change the balance of power to make make it easier for, say China to compete militarily with the U.S. or what have you. Right.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. But I think the kind of countervailing point to that is that, there are the U.S. does not monopolize most of these spaces, and the innovation is going to happen in lots of different places. So if the U.S. doesn't do it, somebody else will probably do it, and that, I think, is one of the other themes that we tried to hit on the report, that one of the U.S.'s great strengths has always been its connections to other centers of innovation, and so you want to make sure that those remain robust and you don't do damage to them, which would in the end slow us down.
So let's now turn to industry R&D, which you earlier dismissed, but I have a long wind up to a question for us to potentially reconsider that. So, looking at this, describing this graph for you guys, basically federal R&D spending as a percentage of GDP dropped from a high of 2% right after the Sputnik era when NASA was in full swing, and is now down around 0.5%. But industry R&D in the 60s was, 0.2% and is now all the way up to 2% of GDP. So you argue that industry is not funding research and development that leads to new breakthroughs in science and engineering and spurs commercial growth later. But interestingly, in the report, you cite the sort of classic example of really path-breaking industry research of Bell Labs, which of course was a monopoly before the government decided to break it up into the baby bells. And one of interestingly, like the firm that seems to be doing the craziest stuff with Alphabet and Waymo and whatnot, that is a big company is Google, that some are arguing today has a monopoly. So what impact, if any, would antitrust regulation have for the relevance for this industry R&D?
Yeah, it was an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it that way, and we didn't really breach antitrust or anti-monopoly legislation. I'm not sure the comparison works in the extent of just part of the problem is just the research that the companies are funding right now, and it's not as if Google doesn't have enough money to do R&D. It is just that so far the kind of the moonshot Project X part of the R&D has not been particularly successful, and a company is basically kind of seems to be phasing most of that out. So I'm not sure it's an issue of how much money they have to spend. I think right now it's just it's the incentives and kind of their ability to do it. We did. There were several times in the report where we had attempts to try to think about how could you recreate a Bell Labs like thing in the United States, and we couldn't come up with a quite honestly a recommendation that made sense, just given the tools that the U.S. government have and what the private sector wants to do. So we were just left with the sense that it was just not going to be recreated. And, again, the private sector's R&D is just so much more kind of right of boom. It's in development and applications, and you're just really missing out. And you just can't replace that the government funding.
So how do you feel about Facebook's talking point that America should keep its tech firms big to compete with Chinese ones? Because, this I understand your focus on the long-term fundamental research, but people also want, Western companies to win out over Huawei and Xiaomi and DJI and whatnot.
Yeah. I don't think that's been a particularly successful argument. I think, again, maybe, Facebook, it was clearly an attempt to try and distract and from the anti-monopoly and the anti-competitiveness investigations. I have not seen any kind of argument that convinces me that that we have to worry about their global competitiveness vis-a-vis the Chinese because of this regulation. And again, a lot of the technologies we're talking about we're not talking about Facebook. We're talking about things that are being developed that are more on the hardware side or more on the manufacturing side. Facebook is doing important work in AI, but I don't think anyone's really buying that argument.
Well, I mean, there is an interesting side to it where if you want the U.S. to sort of like control the way free speech works around the world, it's probably better for Facebook and Google products than Chinese products to be the ones that people are using. So, even though you might want to define tech competitiveness as, who's making the hardware, there's still an aspect of this sort of thing from okay, we can afford more AI researchers, so our recommendation algorithms for your YouTube videos are better, so then you're going to stay on YouTube as opposed to whatever Chinese platform that's going to try to go abroad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly right. If you're using an American platform as opposed to a Chinese platform, it matters. But if we were really, I think probably a more important long term to that competition over values would be, domestically getting regulation about content moderation and privacy protection, and having a consistent and coherent kind of argument, that would either be complementary to or somehow provide different protections than the GDPR and. That I think would be long term more important to kind of promoting a free and open internet than protecting the size of Facebook.
Sure. So one of the things you recommend you recommend the U.S. to do is pursue a moonshot strategy. So how would you structure these, and how, if at all, are they, or would you have them differ from Chinese technology pushes?
Yeah, I think the structure is fairly vague in the report, kind of purposely so. I think you want to frame it around questions or kind of challenges that you want addressed, and so that they're both kind of technology neutral and participant neutral. So, cybersecurity or global pandemic or certain questions in quantum or semiconductor manufacturing, and then basically try to bring the right people together and then fund competing kind of technology approaches to that problem. I think the difference from the Chinese approach is that the Chinese have been very kind of clear about, all right, this is the technology we're going to compete in. Here is the technology we think we want to be competitive in. Here is the metric for success, and here is the national champion or the agency, the branch of the Chinese Academy of Science, whoever that's going to lead it. So I think more prescriptive than this moonshot approach is. And the U.S. We always like to say we don't have industrial policy, but of course we have kind of different types of industrial policy. But this is I think a less hands-on. I think the problem from the U.S. side is you have to remind Congress and the people that fund it that there's going to be failures, which Congress doesn't like to hear. But you have to remember that there's going to be some of these things just don't work.
Yeah, I mean the last time America had a big push, we had Solyndra, right? And even though it, some can argue it could create this big new green revolution in the U.S. At the same time, this was for a moment the biggest scandal in the White House was that they funded some solar panel company that went bust. Interesting thinking about the way you sort of described Chinese industrial moonshot policy sounded a fair amount like the criticisms you leveled at the Pentagon in the way that they do traditional procurement.
Yeah, that's right. Like you, two massive bureaucracies who, have a great deal of oversight, rightfully so, and are trying to build a humongous platform. So, that with the kind of discussion of the DoD procurement, we try to get the balance right. There's some things that are still going to act traditionally and slowly. When you build, an aircraft carrier, it's very hard to, you're not going to do it with a swipe of a credit card. But if you're going to do smaller, more early stage capital intensive types of technologies, then you really have to restructure. And like I said, there's been a huge amount of work coming out of the DIB, the Defense Innovation Board, that I'm kind of trying to address this problem.
So one of the things you focus on in your report is the civil-military divide. There have been these headline-making stories of Google employees protesting their work with the Defense Department. But reading this report sort of made me think back to the stories of old Silicon Valley, and what made it special in the first place was the fact that there were all these hippies there. So I guess my question for you is, would the U.S. really be in a better place today if this culture gap had never formed? And if Silicon Valley really does go super square, is there something that the U.S. may lose from a dynamism perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Silicon Valley itself, a lot of that, the hippies were certainly there, but the hippies came after the government money, right? I think Margaret
Sure.
Margaret Mara's book, makes it pretty clear that, and that government funding and defense contracts were, incredibly important to Fairchild and all the other semiconductor companies. But yeah, I don't think you want to homogenize, right? And you certainly don't want the tech companies to become like the defense contractors. And I think the issue is more, you certainly want to have a ecosystem that has a great deal of diversity in it, and some will work with the DoD and some won't. I think the issue has really been about transparency and kind of communication with employees. And I get the sense that they're going to work this out. I mean, Google may have not decided to renew its contract on Project Maven, but they've been pretty clear the last 6 months to the year that they will continue working with the DoD and want to find new contracts to work with the DoD.
So one of the things you're focusing on is this idea of the U.S. having a role as the central node of global research and development. And I'm curious if you think that given the Chinese emphasis on sort of self-reliance, if there's a world in which China could ever really get there and become this really powerful other pole that draws on other places besides domestic Chinese research.
I think it's hard. I think certainly money has helped a lot, right? I mean, there's certainly a number of prominent cases of, very accomplished scientists who have been lured to China given the amount of money that they can spend on new labs and graduate students and research fellows. The report quotes some statistics that came out of, I think, a study out of Science or Nature, I can't remember which, about how much money the Chinese Academy of Science has spent along BRI, along the Belt and Road. So money certainly helps, but I do think, yes, that generally there's not a huge amount of people who from a quality of life standpoint see living in China as they do living in Boston or San Francisco. And I would expect that given the larger trends in Chinese society under Xi right now, that China is not going to become more attractive in the short term. So yes, I think clearly in the short term, that's harder for China to do.
So another dynamic that you guys break into is this not necessarily being a U.S. China thing as much as a U.S. rest of world dynamic, and it's certainly a common argument you hear with folks saying, America really needs to liberalize its immigration policies, but on the other hand, when you wrote that, oh man, the U.S. may lose like top researchers to Australia or Canada or the UK, from a sort of like power, like balance of power, competitive like West versus China dynamic. Like, does it really matter all that much if these folks are working at the Google Research Center in Alberta as opposed to the one in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I think that's an interesting point that from a kind of alliance perspective, it strengthens all the players. I think, going back to our discussion, maybe whatever it was 10 minutes ago about the positive externalities that are created by these research projects happening in the U.S. that as an American citizen, I probably want them to happen here as opposed to Vancouver. But yes, I think from a kind of balance of power perspective, I prefer Vancouver to Shenzhen.
So say China was in fact losing its edge or coming up on the U.S. faster than the current consensus. Would you change any of these recommendations?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, both the one, we tried to say that all these things in the report we should do no matter, kind of beyond China or despite China, we should do them anyways. So I think for the most part, no, we wouldn't change it. And that actually is kind of slightly depressing or sad about it, because if you can go through and look at similar task force or commissions every decade, basically. And, there was the last one that probably gathered the most attention was called the Gathering Storm, which was out of the U.S. National Academies. And it was about 2007 or 8, if I remember correctly. It talked about the rise of China and India as well, but also just broadly the globalization of science and technology. And most of the recommendations are very similar. How do you deal with basic R&D? What do you do about ensuring the pipeline for STEM talent, immigration, all these issues? And so, these are. And then at that time, the worry about China was really, pretty vague. People said, "Oh yes, China will move up," but it didn't really seem like a real challenge at the time. So I think these things are kind of, unfortunately, kind of perennial problems, and the solutions we came up with were kind of perennial solutions to how do you reinvigorate U.S. innovation.
So in light of that, do you have more faith in the U.S. or the Chinese system to make positive tech policy reforms?
I'm generally more optimistic about the U.S.'s ability than I am the Chinese. I think you listed a lot of the headwinds that Xi is facing right now. I do think there are some real serious questions about how innovative the Chinese system really is. They've gotten very far by spending a lot of money and having a lot of talent, but so far we don't know what the system is going to be like under more severe strain. And so, assuming that, and unfortunately this is a pretty big assumption right now, but assuming we get back to some type of normal politics, depending upon who wins the next election, then I think we will do many of the right things.
Adam Siegel, thanks so much for being a part of China Econ Talk.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.
才是幽默。女王的心意，耀眼的星星，时尚的记忆，搭配什么看我的心情。你可以亲吻我的戒指，但不能碰我皇冠。